Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Some of you did not think I would ever do this, part two. Few of you, a lot of you, you look quite foolish now. If you're new, my name's Connor. Hello, I like to learn about things. I'm from Rhode Island, New England, USA. In that order. I like to learn about things. I'd recommend watching part one. That is up to you. If it looks a little different, it's because I pulled my table over and I'm sitting on the edge of my bed right now. Because I'm more comfy that way and it's a long video. I'm ready to learn though. We're getting to the Vienna part of the Congress of Vienna. If you are not ready to learn, there's the door. Womack is down the hall. You're in the wrong class. Make me some mac and cheese, please. Excuse me. Let's go. Yeah, original link to the video, top of the description, Historia Civilis, preemptive like. Great channel. Let's go. Go. Volume is good. Phones away.
This is how the Congress of Vienna was organized. There was an 8-member central committee that would vote on the final treaty.
Okay. I want to understand.
This group included the 5 great powers, plus 3 secondary powers, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, who each had played an important role in the victory over Napoleon. But the 5 great powers agreed to cut out the Central Committee by negotiating informally among themselves. If the great powers could hammer out a consensus, they could steamroll the Central Committee and the rest of the Congress. In the end, this was where the real power lay.
Okay. Why even include them?
There were
in
a
the
number of
first
subcommittees,
place?
at least 12, that would go off to the side and debate isolated issues among themselves. When they reached a consensus, they would bring their proposal to the Central Committee for approval. Most of these subcommittees were pretty boring, which countries had shipping rights in which rivers, stuff like that. But the most important subcommittee was the German Committee. This committee would be chaired by Metternich of Austria, and would have members from every German state in Central Europe, including Prussia. Together, the German states would go away and collectively decide what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. The negotiations that took place within the German Committee were perhaps the most consequential of the entire Congress.
Okay, so, recap quick. This is a long video, I can't pause too much. So, for Central Committee, the first committee has these 8, but the 3 less powerful, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, were kind of left out of the great powers within the Central Committee, being Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and then within that great powers 5 group, Austria and Prussia and the German states were discussing amongst themselves how best to go forward with borders that fit their interests as, Germans. Right? Okay? Continue. I won't do that every minute and a half.
The first roadblock was that the diplomats couldn't agree upon which map to use as a baseline for negotiations. As I've said before, none of these maps accurately reflected what was going on the ground at the time. There were armies from every great power scattered all over Europe. The default map that Britain, Austria, and Russia wanted to use was the 1792 map with some minor modifications. In other words, they wanted the default map to be France as it existed before any of its revolutionary wars of conquest.
I just want to say quick. So it might be a little confusing how France is, and it was for me at first, but then completely obvious once you think about it for a second. You might be wondering why France is given this great seat at the negotiating table after they were beaten. When you realize how the French Revolution started and Napoleonic Wars, the decades following the French Revolution, it was to get rid of the monarch. And so other monarchs around Europe were afraid that the same might happen to them. And so once Napoleon was defeated and a monarch was reinstated, then they aren't really seen as the enemy anymore. So that makes sense. I'm last.
France
Done.
and Prussia favored using 1806 as a starting point. This was when Prussia was at its beefiest, so obviously the land-hungry Prussians would push for this date. Talleyrand backing Prussia's 1806 proposal was a shrewd move, because not only would it result in an extra beefy France, but more importantly, it allowed Talleyrand to open the Congress by throwing a wedge into the anti-French alliance.
He's the Humphrey.
There was always the danger
Prime
of the
Minister.
four great powers ganging up on a defeated France and taking from them whatever they wanted. Hardenberg of Prussia even spoke of partitioning France. But with Talleyrand at the table, that wasn't happening. By pulling Prussia away from the other great powers, Talleyrand was signaling to everybody that France was capable of making trouble, and if the other great powers wanted to reach a consensus, they would actually have to negotiate with France.
That'd be an interesting alternate history. Like, what if France was broken up after the Napoleonic Wars?
Metternich and Castlereagh eventually talked Hardenberg down from his 1806 position. It's possible that they made certain informal promises regarding Prussian territorial expansion, but those details are lost to us.
So Talleyrand did not get his way.
So it was decided that they would start with the old 1792 borders, but these brought with them a huge problem: Poland. A beefy Poland had existed in 1792, and if it were to be restored, it would come at the expense of Russia and Prussia. Prussia was land hungry and would not willingly let go of any of its Polish provinces without being compensated somewhere else. Russia didn't want Poland to exist at all, since it would serve as nothing more than a buffer between it and Central Europe.
Wait, guys,
Metternich,
I'm
since it would
confused for a
serve
sec.
as
What?
nothing more.
So Poland is not a thing right after the Napoleonic Wars, but they want to recreate it, taking land away from
Than a buffer between it and Central Europe. Metternich loved the idea of restoring Poland. Not only would it keep Russia out of Central Europe, but it would push Russia back from the Austrian border. Metternich was even willing to give up Austria's Polish-speaking provinces to make this happen. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled Hardenberg aside and came to a preliminary agreement over Poland. Prussia would give up its Polish-speaking provinces, but Castlereagh and Metternich promised to compensate for this with German-speaking provinces in Central Europe. The three of them came to a handshake agreement that Prussia would receive Saxony, along with several German cities to the west.
Did Austria give up any of its Polish-speaking parts, or are they not just Prussia?
Under this framework, Prussia's population would increase by 6%, and Poland would remain independent. All three were happy with this. When Tsar Alexander of Russia caught wind of this secret agreement, he threw a pretty public tantrum.
Okay.
He announced that he intended
Here
to
he
keep
comes.
100% of Poland, including the Polish-speaking provinces currently held by Austria and Prussia.
Guys, I need this to be answered. So, I don't want to side with Alexander here, but my question is, so this land that's not Austria or Prussia's inside the red line, that's the same color as Russia's. So at the time, at this time, this exact moment, this, after the Napoleonic Wars, this was part of Russia. And so they wanted to, are they basically taking this land from Russia without really them negotiating?
The Polish-speaking provinces currently held by Austria and Prussia. These demands were extreme, and it was difficult to Russia, including the Polish-speaking provinces currently held by Austria and Prussia.
Oh God, okay.
These demands were extreme, and it was difficult to imagine Austria and Prussia simply handing their territory over to Russia for nothing.
No.
Talleyrand was also unhappy with the secret Poland agreement, and went to see Tsar Alexander privately.
I gotta shut
Talleyrand
up.
specifically wanted to preserve a strong and independent Saxony, since France and Saxony had traditionally been strong allies. Talleyrand made his pitch to the Russian emperor. Alexander replied, "I would rather have war than give up what I occupy." Talleyrand
Understood.
was stunned when he heard this and asked for clarification. "Yes, I would rather have war," Alexander said. Talleyrand began.
I need to keep... My ADD is too much. I really gotta stop talking.
Talleyrand was stunned when he heard this and asked for clarification. "Yes, I would rather have war," Alexander said. Talleyrand began trying to talk the emperor down into a compromise, but before he could make any progress, Alexander stood up and declared, "It's time for the theater. I have to go." He then gave Talleyrand an affectionate hug and ran off. After casually threatening a world war, the Russian emperor stayed out partying until 4 in the morning.
I just picture Talleyrand, like, just like his hand, like, after giving him a handshake and him leaving, just like straight face and like hand still out, like, what just happened?
Talleyrand was appropriately alarmed at this behavior and informed the other great powers of Russia's intransigence. Hardenberg began to fear that Prussia may be on the losing end of a conflict over Poland, so he began to move soldiers around to fortify the parts of Poland that they currently occupied. As if that isn't bad enough, Metternich then found out that his monarch was upset with him. The Austrian Emperor Francis summoned Metternich and chastised him for using the Kingdom of Saxony as a bargaining chip. Austria was trying to position itself internationally as the defender of the rule of law and the defender of the rights of smaller Central European states. They couldn't credibly do this if they sold their neighbors up the river at first opportunity. Emperor Francis told Metternich that the Kingdom of Saxony must survive the negotiations, and it must survive at least half of its current size.
That seems pretty generous. I thought he would have said 100.
Made Metternich's task infinitely more complex.
How the
Prussia must be convinced to take less of Saxony than they had been promised in their handshake deal. This meant that they would want to hold on to their Polish-speaking provinces. In order to make that work, Metternich would need to strike a deal with Tsar Alexander.
Oh my god. All right. So, Talleyrand and Prussia wanted a certain way, didn't go Talleyrand's way, and then Prussia was guaranteed parts of the German states that would give them more population than they would have, giving up their Polish-speaking lands that they occupied. That was cool. Then Russia freaks out after Talleyrand goes over, or doesn't freak out, just is insane. And then Talleyrand tells them about war, and then Francis tells Metternich he can't let Saxony fall, or less go to the Germans.
Metternich went to meet with Alexander, and things got heated. Metternich did not find the Russian emperor particularly intimidating, and spoke to him in the manner that he would speak to any other diplomat. Alexander wasn't really used to that, and after 2 long hours of back and forth, he jumped to his feet, marched over to Metternich, and challenged him to a duel. This kind of thing was above Metternich's pay grade, and required the personal intervention of the Austrian emperor. Francis of Austria soothed Alexander's ego by saying that of course he would win a duel against Metternich, but murdering the Austrian foreign minister might cause an international incident. Recall Metternich's first impression of Alexander, the biggest baby on earth. Was he wrong? After this incident, Alexander would privately describe Metternich as, quote, a permanent obstacle and, quote, a sworn enemy. The feeling was mutual. Russia was apparently a dead end, so Metternich went to Prussia next. Metternich explained to Hardenberg that he could now only give Prussia half of Saxony. This was not what they had agreed to, and Hardenberg was understandably upset. The 2 diplomats parted ways with sore feelings and no agreement. The entire deal over Poland seemed to be dead, or at least dying, and the prospect of war with Russia was becoming a growing concern. In desperation, Metternich brought Britain and France into the negotiations. He thought that if three great powers could bring a compromise to the other two, they might be pressured into accepting it. Castlereagh went to see Alexander.
Too nuts.
He explained to the Russian Tsar that Britain would not accept a Poland under Russian domination. The British public demanded an independent Poland. Alexander finally let his guard down, or at least pretended to, and confessed to Castlereagh that the war with Napoleon had left him in a precarious situation back in Russia. The Russians had sacrificed everything to defeat Napoleon, and the Russian aristocracy felt that they deserved Poland as a reward. Alexander doesn't come right out and say this, but he hints that he had promised them exactly that before he left. The implication was that there may be a coup if he went back empty-handed. Castlereagh explained to Alexander that if he took Poland without the consent of the other great powers, it would not end well for him. Prussia and Austria would become permanent enemies of Russia and natural allies to the occupied Polish population. One way or another, Poland would be free.
So it's like saying to Alexander, either back down and face having some coup or overthrow the Tsar aristocracy or whatnot, or go ahead and go to war with everyone else over Poland and occupy Polish areas, and then lose terribly that way, and then be thrown out for sure.
It seemed that negotiations were approaching an impasse. And then disaster struck. News got out that the Prussian king had publicly signed off on the Russian annexation of Poland. Tsar Alexander had been personally negotiating with him in secret. Hardenberg was inconsolable. His own king had just stabbed him in the back. It was humiliating. What made matters worse was that the Prussian king was too stupid to realize he wasn't helping. This turn of events lit a fire under the members of the Congress.
Did that signing happen just now, just as out of nowhere, or was that like a result of some previous signing before this? Because if that was just out of nowhere, that's
Castlereagh grabbed Hardenberg
wrench.
and said that if Hardenberg could get the Prussian king to walk back those Poland comments, then Britain would be prepared to back Prussia's demand to annex 100% of Saxony. Hardenberg agreed and marched off to wrestle back control of his monarch. Metternich stayed strategically silent during this exchange. He had secretly written to Castlereagh and promised Austrian support in this scheme, even though it was in direct violation of his emperor's instructions to preserve at least half of Saxony. But that was a problem for another day. And just like that, because of Russian overreach, Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria were all on the same page when it came to Poland. It was 4 against 1. With newfound urgency, the 4 powers came together and drafted 3 possible options to resolve the Poland crisis. Option number 1 called for an enlarged Poland, which would include the Polish-speaking provinces from Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Option number 2 called for a reduced Poland, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia each held on to their Polish-speaking provinces. Option
Good
number
question,
3.
guys. How did Poland get to this? Was Poland destroyed during the Napoleonic Wars? And so Poland was a thing right before the Napoleonic Wars, and so they're trying to make it a new thing? Or, what's the deal with Poland, in the decades before this?
3 called for a full partition, where Russia, Austria,
Number 2.
and Prussia each held on to their Polish-speaking provinces.
Okay.
Option number 3 called for a full partition, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia would come in and divide Poland 3 ways.
Okay.
Under this plan, the people of Poland would have certain political protections across all 3 countries. You might notice that there was no option in which Russia got to keep all of Poland. That was on purpose. Talleyrand was selected to go and present these options to the Russian Tsar. He explained to Alexander that France's official position was that there should be an independent Poland. He said that if Russia acted on its own and annexed Poland, Prussia and Austria would have no choice but to seriously consider a potential war with Russia. In such a scenario, both would seek to strengthen themselves through territorial expansion. If 3 of the great powers were going around Europe gobbling up territory, France and Britain would have no choice but to intervene. Talleyrand was very clear with Alexander. If he took Poland by force, the great powers would go to war. Alexander was growing frustrated with this constant diplomatic meddling, and finally snapped. "I have 200,000 men in the Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, and I would like to see anyone try to drive me out of it. I have given Prussia Saxony, and Austria consents to it." Alexander had spies everywhere, and apparently he knew that Saxony was secretly being used as a bargaining chip. Talleyrand feigned innocence and asked an innocent used spies everywhere, and apparently he knew that Saxony was secretly being used as a bargaining chip. Talleyrand feigned innocence and asked an innocent question. How could Prussia annex Saxony when they had no claim to the Saxon throne? Alexander responded, "If the king of Saxony will not abdicate, he will be packed off to Russia. He will die there." This was an open threat of violence. Die there. If the king of Saxony had no claim to the Saxon throne. How could Prussia annex Saxony when they had no claim to the Saxon throne? Alexander responded, "If the king of Saxony will not abdicate, he will be packed off to Russia. He will die there."
How would you make that happen?
This was an open threat of violence against another monarch, and it was not the answer that Talleyrand was expecting. After a pause, he responded with caution. The Congress was not assembled to witness a violent assault of this kind. At this, Alexander truly lost his temper. "Do you really think I give much weight to all your parchments and treaties? The king of Prussia will be the king of Prussia and Saxony, just as I will be the emperor of Russia and the king of Poland." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Talleyrand alone with his thoughts.
Okay.
When Metternich learned of Alexander's outburst, he finally lost his patience. He decided to meet once more with the Russian Tsar, this time with a different negotiating tactic.
Listen, you're gonna die.
He told Alexander that Austria was considering unilaterally selecting a Polish king to rule over an independent Poland. This was an unspoken threat. Metternich was telling Alexander that all he had to do was snap his fingers, and Poland would rise up against Russian occupation. Alexander responded by issuing an unspoken threat of his own. He invited Metternich to come to Poland and inspect the Russian soldiers stationed there, all 200,000 of them. Metternich then dropped the subtlety. He flatly told Alexander that if he took Poland, the entire Congress of Vienna would be against him. After this, tempers flared, voices were raised, and things got personal. From this moment on, Metternich would refuse to be in the same room with the Russian Tsar unless others were present, which frankly is exactly the kind of grudge that I respect. And then a very troubling thing happened.
Okay, I understand what I didn't understand before. Okay.
Without notice, the Russian soldiers in Saxony began to pull back and leave. Shortly after this, the Prussian soldiers occupying parts of Poland did the same. All of a sudden, there was a lot of military movement, and nobody knew why. Within a matter of weeks, a lot more Prussian soldiers entered Saxony, and a lot more Russian soldiers entered Poland. It became clear that there was some kind of handoff happening, a secret agreement between Russia and Prussia. Both were openly fortifying their positions and preparing for war. Bad, bad, bad. Castlereagh wrote a summary of these events to Prime Minister Liverpool back in Britain. Quote, "Unless the Emperor of Russia can be brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct, the peace, which we have so dearly purchased, will be but of a short duration."
What is Prussia doing? Going one way? Seems to be a wild card here.
You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary, as another Bonaparte.
Sorry guys, I couldn't pay attention anymore. I had to go to bed. Okay, continue.
You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary, as another Bonaparte. Back in Britain, the domestic political situation was approaching a boiling point. The narrow conservative Whig majority in the House of Commons was in jeopardy. The liberal Whig opposition had weaponized the Saxony and Poland crisis, and were using it as a rallying cry against authoritarianism everywhere. The liberals had the public on their side, and now they were calling for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland, with no concessions to the other powers whatsoever. Liverpool was in a precarious situation, and could not appear to be throwing the people of Poland to the Russian wolves, or bears or whatever. The liberals wanted to paint Liverpool as...
Does any country have the national animal a wolf? Because they should.
Sympathetic to the Russian tyrant, and so Liverpool needed to prove them wrong. He wrote to Castlereagh, instructing him to back away from any deal that would partition Saxony or Poland. The official British position would now call for full independence for both countries.
Everything's a mess now.
You would think that such an abrupt shift in priorities would blow up the negotiations, but it really didn't. After being stabbed in the back by Russia and Prussia, Metternich felt no obligation to bend over backwards for them anymore. The Austrian emperor had always wanted an independent Saxony, and Metternich had always wanted an independent Poland, so he joined the British in calling for both. Talleyrand had always favored full independence for both countries, and quickly followed Metternich's lead. This audacious show of force from Russia and Prussia spooked every small and medium-sized state in Central Europe. If Saxony could get steamrolled like this, nobody was safe. Virtually every Central European state found their courage and backed Castlereagh and Metternich's call for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland.
Austria
had long sought to position itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law, and now that strategy was paying off. Metternich suddenly found himself at the center of attention, the most popular guy in Vienna, the hub to which every Central European state wanted to attach itself. When the dust settled, it became clear that Russia and Prussia's power grab had been a massive blunder. Tsar Alexander must have realized that he had backed himself into a corner, because he began sending signals to Austria that he might be satisfied with less than 100% of Poland. This was exactly the sort of opening that everyone was waiting for. Attention then turned to Prussia. There were reports that Prussia was building fortifications inside of occupied Saxony, which drew broad international condemnation. It soon became conspicuous that Tsar Alexander was remaining silent. Prussia was being left hanging out to dry. A desperate Hardenberg visited Talleyrand and tried to get him to break away from the other powers by making wild promises. At one point, Hardenberg offered France the Netherlands, which of course was a red line for Britain, and not something that Hardenberg was in a position to give away.
No.
Talleyrand wisely turned him down. Hardenberg was out of options. He backed down from his maximalist position and began telling people that he would accept no less than half of Saxony. Metternich jumped at this. An independent Saxony at half of its current size would satisfy both the Austrian Emperor and all of those smaller Central European states.
Right.
After some back and forth over specifics, an agreement was reached. Prussia would receive half of Saxony, along with some German-speaking territory along the Rhine. A reduced Saxony would remain fully independent, and war would be averted. But then there was still the issue with Poland. Alexander reopened negotiations by offering to let Austria and Prussia keep their Polish-speaking provinces, a real change of tune from last time. Castlereagh then called for the creation of a strong Polish constitution built upon liberal democratic values. Tsar Alexander immediately agreed and publicly thanked Castlereagh for his advocacy on behalf of the people of Poland. If you find Alexander's change in demeanor a little shocking, you aren't alone. Scarily. It's clear that there were some back-channel talks going on during the Saxony crisis, and it seems
Prussia and Russia
that concessions were made in order to get Alexander to back off and throw Prussia under the bus. What was happening now over Poland seemed well choreographed, as if it had all been drawn up in some back room somewhere. The great powers quickly reached an agreement over Poland, and it looked like this. Austria and Prussia would be allowed to keep their Polish-speaking provinces. The rest would become the Kingdom of Poland. The new kingdom would have a strong liberal democratic constitution, with an independent legislature, independent courts, and an independent army. The King of Poland would be a quasi-ceremonial role, tightly constrained by the Polish constitution. Under this deal, it was decided that Tsar Alexander of Russia would separately and simultaneously become the King of Poland. On paper, this satisfied the British and Austrian demands for an independent Poland, since the new kingdom retained the right to make its own laws and field its own military. It also satisfied Alexander's demand to take Poland as a prize for defeating Napoleon. But obviously, Poland could not be truly independent under this arrangement. With the Russian emperor as their king, it became impossible for Poland to resist creeping Russian influence. For the rest of Alexander's reign, he would chip away at Poland's independent political institutions and slowly work towards swallowing Poland into the Russian Empire.
Yeah, I don't know how the big powers didn't see that coming.
By the time his successor came to the throne, the new Russian emperor declared that he no longer felt bound by the Polish constitution. And then that was that. It's undeniable that Castlereagh and Metternich sacrificed Poland for an independent Saxony. Perhaps they saw the writing on the wall. The truth was that if Russia took Poland by force, Austria and Britain really weren't in a position to take it back. Perhaps they decided that if they couldn't stop Russia from taking Poland, they could turn the whole thing into a poison pill. As an island of liberalism within the Russian Empire, Poland would confound and distract Tsar Alexander for the rest of his reign.
Genius. Poison pill.
The Poland and Saxony crisis brought the great powers back to the brink of war. But now that there was a deal in place, messy as it was, there was finally room to breathe. One of the conditions attached to the Poland deal was that Tsar Alexander, having received his great prize, was to get out of the way and let everybody else negotiate what they came to negotiate. There were still several outstanding questions that needed to be settled, but none more pressing than the fate of the German-speaking states in Central Europe. Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland
I feel like I'm actually following this very well.
Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress of Vienna had agreed to use the 1792 borders as a starting point for negotiations. Well, in 1792, the Holy Roman Empire existed. Metternich had no interest in turning back the clock. The Holy Roman Empire had proved itself to be a totally inept institution when faced with a real threat. The German Committee had the task of figuring out what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. As far as Metternich could see, there were 4 possible paths forward.
Guys, I really want to learn about what happens. I want to learn about the 7 Years' War and what happens between the 7 Years' War and Napoleonic War and like the French Revolutionary Wars.
Option number 1, complete independence for everybody. Option number 2, a German empire united under one government. Option number 3, a loose confederation of German states.
So the
Option
HRE.
number 4, Austria and Prussia expand and conquer their smaller neighbors. All 4 of these
Guys, sorry, but isn't number 3 sort of going right back to
options presented problems. If they decided to go with option number 2, a united German empire, Metternich would obviously insist upon a Habsburg emperor.
right?
But
Prussia
given
and
recent
Austria.
experience over Saxony, Metternich did not believe that the Prussians would submit to the Austrians
No
like
way.
that. In addition to that, Metternich was getting signals from Castlereagh that the British would not sign off on the creation of a German empire. So option number
No,
2
World
seemed
War
a
I.
dead end. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia conquering their neighbors, didn't seem great either. Such aggressive behavior would frighten all the other great powers, and if any of them tried to protect one of the smaller German states, they would all be at war again. That left option number 1 or option number 3, either complete independence or a loose confederation. Of the two, Metternich's preference was for a loose confederation. He thought that complete independence would leave Central Europe weak and unable to defend itself. It would only be a matter of time until some outside power went to war with one of Austria's weaker neighbors.
Piece by piece.
And then Austria would intervene, and then we're back in a great power conflict situation. A loose confederation, on the other hand, might be enough to deter meddling from outside powers. If there was to be a German confederation, Metternich would first need to mend the relationship with Hardenberg. The Prussian duplicity over Saxony had left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, but if the two great powers were to live under the same umbrella, they would have to be friends. Metternich began making his pitch to some of the smaller German states. He found very little resistance. Many felt burned over the Saxony debacle and sought a closer strategic relationship with Austria for their own protection. Metternich's vision for a German confederation would look like this. All states within the Confederation would maintain their independence, except when it came to matters of military defense. Under the German Confederation, an attack on one would be an attack on all. Any outside power sticking their nose into German affairs would be met with the combined strength of every German state.
Like a
This
NATO?
ruffled some feathers, because it restricted the
My
ability
feathers.
of German states to make alliances
Ruffled.
with outside powers. Bavaria in particular was upset by this, but Metternich soothed things over by pointing out that this would put them in a military alliance with 38 other German states. Such a thing had not been possible under the Holy Roman Empire, and such a thing would not be possible to anybody out there negotiating on their own. Of course, Austria and Prussia were to be exempt from this. They had their own goofy reasoning. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires. Whatever. The real
I'm
reason
trying to find a good name. It's like if you ever play those pipe games, like on your phone, where you try to like connect the pipes or something. It's like they start off, and then every direction they go in all of these meetings, it's like you gotta like twist one pipe to fit, but then that inadvertently twists another pipe so it doesn't fit, and then you gotta go keep repairing, and then leaks, and then pipes break again and repairing, and then you finally have like two pipes to fit left, and it's just hard to.
is
I hope
that
that
they were great
made
powers
sense.
and reserved the right to make alliances or war as they wished. Austria and Prussia would be the two anchors of the German Confederation.
Hold on.
Whatever. The real reason is that they were great powers and reserved the right, whatever. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires, had their own goofy reasoning. They had Russia were to be exempt from this. They had
Okay,
the
I got
right
it.
to make alliances or war as they wished.
Okay.
Austria
Prussia's a big
and
boy,
Prussia
it's
would
not
be
the
the
same
two
rules
anchors of the German Confederation,
as
and
the
it was
other German
paramount
states.
to the survival of the Confederation that the two great powers within it got along. The German Confederation would have a central diet, a legislature, located in the free city of Frankfurt. The Diet was conceived as a sort of United Nations of Germany, where various independent German states would come together and resolve any disputes that might lead to war. They would also work to reduce barriers so that Germans could live and work and write in any German-speaking country without fear.
Where's
To this
Otto?
end, they created a weak federal legal system to protect certain political rights across borders. Hardenberg of Prussia was surprisingly supportive of this proposal. The German Diet treated Austria and Prussia as equal partners, which was reassuring to an insecure and young power such as Prussia.
Now, at this moment, if just one-on-one Austria and Prussia would go to war with each other, obviously later, in the Franco-Prussian, or in the Austro-Prussian War, Prussia handles them easily. But is Prussia the more powerful one at this time, or are they both, more equal? Italy. Okay. I'm excited for this one. I know very little about Italy. Not just this time period.
There were other areas that could not be fully restored under the 1792 borders. Italy had been totally reshaped under French rule, and the Congress of Vienna needed to decide how much French influence was acceptable in the region going forward. At the moment of his defeat, Napoleon had been king of Italy, really northern Italy, and his son had been king of Rome, also northern Italy, and one of his top generals had been the king of Naples, southern Italy. Obviously, this
Murat? Was
arrangement
that
couldn't
Murat?
continue, but it was not immediately
Guys, was that Murat?
clear what the Congress should do. Metternich and the Austrian emperor took a particular interest in this. They considered northern Italy Austria's backyard, and Metternich believed that if Austria and France were in constant competition for influence in northern Italy, it would eventually end in another war. Whatever the new political settlement in northern Italy looked like, it had to be able to resist French influence going forward. Metternich spoke to Castlereagh about this, and the two found that they were of the same mind. Castlereagh told him that Britain was not overly concerned about the future of northern Italy, so long as it remained out of reach.
I love Britain's role in so many conflicts, and America's role later on when America is a more of a thing. Technically, they are a thing right now, but not that, not on the levels of these guys. And it's amazing how they're much more of like, okay, we don't have to worry about our land being threatened because of our navy, because of the English Channel separation from the Europe mainland. And so they're much more of like, just like, how can we make it so that our negotiations go towards making no one very powerful? Like, just trying to keep people weak enough.
The two men came to an agreement. Remembering the Poland-Saxony crisis,
To not
Castlereagh
mess up
said
their
that the
empire.
British public was in an anti-imperialist mood right now, and so he couldn't appear to support any sweeping annexations of territory. However, Britain had no problem with Austrian hegemony in the region. If Metternich could draw up a plan that only made minor territorial adjustments, wink wink, he could count on Castlereagh's support. Once it became
Wink, wink.
clear to all parties that the future of Italy was being discussed, there were calls to replicate the success of the German committee by forming an Italian committee. Metternich and Castlereagh shut this talk down.
No.
Per their agreement, the future of Italy would be decided by Metternich alone.
So this is the beef between the Italians and Austrians in the
This
First World
is what
War.
he came up with. Austria would conduct a minor territorial adjustment by directly annexing Lombardy and Venice. This would add millions of Italians to the Austrian Empire. Metternich knew that the Hungarians would have opposed any deal that added more ethnic Germans to the empire, since it would have upset the delicate balance within Austria. Expanding into northern Italy was seen as politically neutral, so Metternich used this opportunity to beef up Austria by annexing one of the richest parts of Europe.
Yeah, Austria seems to suffer from too much diversity in culture and ethnicity and whatnot. The Germans are a much more unified people, and the Austrians, they have the Hungarians, they have Italians here, they have more in the Balkans that are not so much identify with Vienna. And so I think that's a big doom from the start for them, is that they have too many factions in them with deep underlying cultural differences that'll never make them strong enough together. Is that right? Am I wrong?
Castlereagh noticed this, but deemed it minor enough to escape the notice of the British public. Next, Metternich recreated the Duchy of Parma and handed it over to Mary Louise of Austria, the Austrian Emperor's eldest daughter. The fact that she remained the wife of Napoleon was a bit inconvenient, so Metternich carved out a rule so that the duchy would go to some nephew of the Spanish king upon her death. Spain had been upset when Metternich got the authority to reshape northern Italy, and this was Metternich's way of throwing them a bone. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was also recreated and
it's not even connected to the
handed
sea.
over to the brother of the Austrian emperor. Similarly, the Duchy of Modena was recreated and handed to some cousin of the Austrian emperor. Noticing a pattern yet?
Yeah.
By doing this, Metternich technically met Castlereagh's requirement to not openly annex all of northern Italy, but it was a bit deceptive. In some cases, the prime ministers of these new states would be Austrian officials hand-picked by Metternich. On paper, these were all independent countries, but in reality, the Austrians were treating northern Italy like a colony. In addition to all this, Metternich reformed the Papal States, which was an important sticking point to the majority Catholic Austrian Empire. He also strengthened and restored the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. As an independent and fairly strong...
I don't know why this is annoying me so much, but what is this white, unfilled one on the western coast?
Regional power. They would serve as a buffer against any future French expansion. Finally, Napoleon's former general was eventually removed from southern Italy, and a distant relation of the King of Spain returned to rule the region once more. I should briefly talk about how Napoleon's general was removed from southern Italy. It involves an event known to history as the 100 Days.
Is this Mura? Or is this...
Here's a brief summary of what happened. When the Congress of Vienna was like 6 months into negotiations, Napoleon secretly slipped away from his confinement on the island of Elba and landed in southern France. He marched north with maybe 1,000 supporters, but as he advanced, thousands more flocked to his banner. 3 weeks after landing in France, he captured Paris without firing a shot. The Allies had long feared something like this, and in fact, during the last 6 months of negotiations, the great powers had kept their armies mobilized for this very reason. Within hours of Napoleon's disappearance from Elba, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were
I wonder why they didn't execute Napoleon. I know I see the comments already rolling in of like, it would have upset a lot of people and it was too delicate. It was better to set him aside. But I know hindsight is 20/20. I know he goes back, but man.
Marching on France. 3 months after Napoleon captured Paris, British and Prussian armies faced the French outside the town of Waterloo in the Netherlands, current-day Belgium. At Waterloo, Napoleon was soundly defeated by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon fled, and about a month later, he surrendered to the British, who promptly sent him to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where, under the watchful eye of the British, he would spend the rest of his days.
I heard he was going to go to New Orleans after. I don't know if that's true.
I've been strategically talking around the 100 days for this entire video. Because while it's certainly militarily interesting and Napoleonically interesting, it's not diplomatically interesting.
Okay.
From the perspective of the Congress of Vienna, the 100 Days were a brief pause in negotiations, after which everyone just picked back up where they left off.
That makes perfect sense.
Also, and this may annoy some people, but it must be said, the 100 Days were not a particularly close call. When Napoleon captured Paris, he had maybe 50,000 soldiers at his disposal.
What if you won
The
Waterloo?
Allies had 1 million. Naturally,
Ooh, okay.
Napoleon immediately began raising 100,000 additional soldiers. But so did the Allies, and by this point, the Allies were faster. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo, there would have been another Waterloo later that summer.
Sorry, Alexander is nuts. Maybe call him up, even though you invaded
If he
him.
had won 10 Waterloos, the Allies still would have had him outnumbered. The entire 100 Days was an act of delusion.
Is that the
and
case,
there was
guys?
never a serious
You
threat
liars.
of a French victory.
No, you're not liars.
Anyways, I bring all that up because Napoleon's
Interesting,
former
though.
general, the King of Naples, sided with Napoleon during the
Nero.
crisis, which gave Metternich a good excuse to remove him from power and have him executed.
Please tell me I'm right there. The slave trade. Is America going to get a shout out here?
So here was the framework for the final settlement. Broadly speaking, Europe would return to its 1792 borders. Russia would swallow up Poland under a strict constitutional arrangement, and Prussia would
What's that tiny part in between Poland and Austria?
annex half of Saxony.
Okay.
The Holy Roman Empire would be replaced with the much more practical German Confederation.
Of
Northern Italy would become an anti-French zone under Austrian supervision.
So, guys, is it because Castlereagh and the UK saw France, the Emperor of Austria, as less intimidating, or Austria as a whole as less intimidating than France, and so they were okay in order to keep French influence and expansion outside of Italy? They just had Austria do that.
With negotiations drawing to a close, there was one lingering issue that had not yet been addressed. The British Prime Minister Liverpool instructed Castlereagh to begin discussing slavery. By 1815, the British anti-slavery political movement had truly become a force to be reckoned with. In 1788, a bunch of local abolitionist groups sent Parliament 60,000 signatures calling for the abolition of slavery. In 1815, these same groups gathered almost 1 million signatures, but this time...
This surprises me because you'd think that, the slavery that you think of in the Americas, would not have been really seen by a lot of people on the British Isles. And so the fact that there's this giant movement behind it out of like a good faith thing of kind of like of humans on Britain, I'm surprised at how it got started so well in the
time. They didn't send them to Parliament. They sent them to Castlereagh in Vienna. One statistic that was not lost on anybody was that the number of signatures sent to Castlereagh was greater than the total number of votes in the last election. This was not simply an act of protest. It was a shot across the bow. By this time, every British city and most British towns had an abolitionist group that was active in local politics. It was not uncommon for the average British voter to hear about the ongoing sin of slavery on a weekly basis in their church and in their newspaper. The issue became impossible to avoid.
Good for them, honestly. That surprises me. Welcoming.
After one particularly incendiary pamphlet went viral, more than 300,000 women pledged to boycott sugar since it was exclusively produced with slave labor. People were hungry for action, and when the government showed no interest in doing anything, they grabbed at whatever consumer choices might make a difference. Political activism against slavery was so popular in some circles that it became fashionable, literally. This medallion, called the Wedgwood Medallion, was mass-produced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Men generally wore them around their necks, and women around their wrists or
that makes me happy.
Pinned into their hair. The inscription reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image of a man kneeling in chains became the most widely distributed piece of art depicting a black man ever, and the unofficial logo of the anti-slavery movement. In 1807, at the end of a political fight that lasted more than 15 years, Britain passed an act that abolished the British slave trade.
Guys, that's just pretty cool. Am I not a man and a brother? And, that's powerful.
It did not abolish the act of slavery, but it made it illegal to transport enslaved persons across the Atlantic to the colonies. Advocates believed that without new bodies coming over from Africa, chattel slavery in the colonies would mostly die out within 1 or 2 generations. They were wrong, but it was nevertheless a big deal that Britain finally acknowledged that their goal was to eventually abolish slavery. The abolitionists were correctly not satisfied by this half measure.
How would they think that? Obviously, slave women would give birth in America, so
demanded nothing less than the complete and total abolition of slavery. And as the years went on, their influence only continued to grow. Lord Liverpool inherited this political situation when he became Prime Minister, and he wasn't happy about it. He was holding on to his conservative Whig majority in Parliament by the barest of threats, and now the abolitionists had sent 1 million signatures to his foreign secretary in Vienna. Liverpool didn't really care one way or the other about slavery, but if he didn't give these people something, they might topple his government. He instructed Castlereagh to try to get some anti-slavery commitments into the final agreement at Vienna. Castlereagh approached the 8-member Central Committee, that is, the 5 great powers plus Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, and asked them to include a provision in the final agreement that committed everybody to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Of those present, only Britain and Sweden had abolished the slave trade. Castlereagh's opening position was that everybody else should adopt Britain's anti-slavery laws. Another way of saying that is that Castlereagh was not committing Britain to any further anti-slavery reforms. This fact was not lost on Castlereagh's negotiating partners. Spain, Portugal, and France threw a fit. France is an interesting case because they had heroically abolished slavery at the beginning of their revolution.
Isn't Portugal a big thing?
And then under Napoleon, they shamefully brought it back. Spain and Portugal were the other 2 powers most heavily enmeshed with the slave trade.
Yeah.
Spain, Portugal, and France argued that Britain only wanted to abolish the slave trade because they had a head start out in the colonies. They also argued that an agreement like this would give the British Navy an excuse to stop and inspect every ship in the Atlantic. In other words, this would all be to Britain's advantage. Castlereagh tried to respond by appealing to morality, but this only incensed them even further. One Spanish diplomat got in Castlereagh's face and told him, "The English have always been good at making business march alongside honor." Joke's on him, Castlereagh was Irish.
I'm Irish.
Bo Jiden?
If we think about this for a moment, Castlereagh could have shown Britain's commitment to the cause by talking about complete and total abolition, which would have hurt Britain more than anyone. If he had walked into the room talking about abolition, he would have had some credibility because he would have been saying, "Let's all do something difficult together." But Castlereagh didn't bring up total abolition because he was an imperialist and he wasn't that personally bothered by slavery. After some agonizing negotiations, they agreed to attach a document to the final treaty coming out of Vienna called a Declaration of Intent to Abolish the Slave Trade. At Spain and Portugal's insistence, this declaration would be non-binding, which sucks. Castlereagh was like, if it's non-binding, we're gonna need to show people some specific goals at least. France agreed to abolish the slave trade within 5 years. they would blow right past that
Does
deadline.
non-binding mean it won't be enforced? It's just like a saying.
Spain agreed to abolish the slave trade within 8 years, with some pretty large loopholes. They would blow right past that deadline. Portugal would only agree to abolish the slave trade north of the equator. And since they didn't really have any colonies north of the equator, this was pretty much a giant middle finger to the rest of
Right, I heard Brazil is by far, like, of all the, I think like 8 or 12% of slaves went to the U.S. Something like 80% or something of slaves in the slave trade went to Brazil plantations. Let me know if I'm wrong there. I don't want to mess that up. But yeah, that's like saying, okay, yeah, all right, abolish everywhere that's not us.
the Congress. Castlereagh also got all of the participants to declare their intention to eradicate slavery once and for all, but they provided absolutely no specifics and no deadlines. A meaningless statement meant to simply soothe public opinion. In the end, Britain's attempt to inject anti-slavery commitments into the Congress was a failure. The reason it was a failure is that Castlereagh didn't even really try. He was half-hearted from the start, and his reluctance to come in there with any radical proposals was a signal to the other great powers that Britain wasn't really taking this seriously. It's a shame, because this was a moment when something big could have been accomplished. Britain had serious leverage and serious public support, and Castlereagh didn't use any of it. One of the consequences of Castlereagh's lack of enthusiasm in 1815 was that slavery continued in places like Cuba and Brazil until the late 1880s. That's a lot of lives and a lot of years, and it's a real stain on Castlereagh's record that he didn't really try to do anything about it. But from a purely political standpoint, the anti-slavery negotiations worked. Prime Minister Liverpool now had something to show the discontents back home. And for now, that was enough. The Treaty of Vienna was finalized in June of 1815. All of the great powers signed off on it. The only outlier was Spain, who remained upset over Metternich's heavy-handed treatment of northern Italy. Spain refused to sign the final document, which was unfortunate. But so long as all the great powers
But we gave you one piece of landlocked Italy.
were on board, this was deemed acceptable. The final treaty was mostly built upon realist principles and created a balance of power with clearly defined spheres of influence that would, hopefully, prevent future great power conflicts. After Vienna, it was widely understood and accepted that if anybody invaded one of those tiny German states, it would automatically mean war with Prussia and Austria. If anybody invaded northern Italy, it would automatically mean war with Austria. If anybody invaded the Netherlands, it would automatically mean war with Britain. If anybody invaded Poland, it would automatically mean war with Russia. The belief was that so long as governments understood what was and wasn't off limits, minor disagreements could be solved diplomatically, and great power conflicts on the scale of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars could be entirely avoided. It was in the interest of all great powers to respect these limitations, and if any great power was found to be acting recklessly or belligerently, it was in the interest of everybody else to put them in their place.
Russia.
After 25 years of chaos and war, the great powers were having a go at stability. This international system that emerged from Vienna is sometimes called the Concert of Europe, as in all of Europe acting in concert or in unison. The next 15 years would put a severe test upon the concert system, and we will see in time whether these frenzied and far-reaching negotiations were worth it.
Awesome video like always. I did it. Took me 2 goes, but I did it. I tried on purpose to speak less today than I did on the portion I watched last night because I did a lot of talking last night. But awesome. Biggest takeaway for sure. My biggest takeaway is how it's an awesome dance, or it's like you have to take into account the power of each of the nations, or each of the power of each of the powers, if you will, and then have them take control over certain areas to, and like obviously, like a perfect example at the end when Spain wasn't happy. It's like, oh well, all this work just to have one cog, Spain unhappy. That's pretty good. All right, stamp it for approval. So you have to take into account the power of each one. What am I trying to think of the word? Of each party. The power of each party, and give them a slight bit of what they want while making sure it ties in well with the bits that they're giving to everyone else, and all fitting it in a way that makes any scenario, oh, well, what if this country attacks this? Well, then this will happen. Well, what if they do that? Well, this will happen. And it's very, I want to say dumbed down as a good word. I think it was dumbed down. If I understood it well, which I think I did, it had to have been kind of dumbed down. Look, I don't think I'm learning more. But whenever I learn a lot about history and the major points in history, I realize that the aura of mysticism and like godliness and legend around people in the past that have to do with these great conflicts that we all read about is swept away with. That aura is kind of swept away with in a good way that shows me these are human beings with brains like you and I had, and we're thinking logically on a macro scale, and it makes them more human. You know, it makes all the people more human and makes me able to connect with them more. Awesome video. I hope I wasn't too annoying in the first part, guys, or the second. See you next time. All right, I want to continue learning about stuff like this. I'm going to continue Alexander and a bunch of other stuff. See you guys.